Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod. Well, this morning, at my suggestion, might I even say urging, we are going to talk about football. The Super Bowl is coming right up, and it's very much a unique American sport, just to our country primarily, and very much part of the American ethos, especially toward the end of January. And in the spirit of full disclosure, I will also acknowledge that having lived in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, I'm a Steelers fan. Horrors. And now that they're out of the playoffs, I have reverted to being an Eagles fan since I've spent so much time in Philadelphia.
You're a fickle fan.
Good choice.
So I have encouraged my colleagues, Lisa and Joseph, to take a look in as much depth as we can at football.
And football and its archetypal power, because one of the things that we cannot escape in the United States is seeing the tremendous amount of collective energy that football rouses in the American psyche. It's a billion dollar industry in all kinds of dimensions. People cordon off massive amounts of time. They come together.
And money.
And
right?
money. I mean, it's extraordinary.
Yes. Yeah.
We have a number of stadiums. Stadiums can hold up to 80,000 people. And literally millions more watch the 256 professional football games that are played during the football season. It is a gigantic phenomenon.
And it is, and it's a phenomena of the psyche.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And of course, I'm also holding that we have a lot of listeners who are not in America and are not American. And of course, and we did talk about this when choosing this topic, you know, there are similar phenomena that go on with sports like what we call soccer. We did think about just discussing sports in general, but we wanted to stick specifically with football. But for those of you who may not be familiar with American football, we hope you can follow along and apply the insights to what's relevant in your culture.
And because this is a psychic and psychologically oriented approach, of course, the same kind of psychic phenomena take place with other sports in other countries because we're all human. So if we don't project it onto football, we are projecting it onto something else from time immemorial and across cultures.
So let's jump in. Let's name some of the things that we think are going on with this powerful phenomena.
Well, I mean, honestly, I think that I should be the one to kind of start off because I am, after all, from Philadelphia and home of the reigning champion Eagles.
Fly,
you say that with
Eagles,
such
fly.
borrowed pride.
And, you know, I have to say that I am definitely a fickle fan. I'm not a huge football fan, but it's been really fun. It was fun being a Philadelphian last year and, you know, round about this time of year last year, you know, the whole city was just so full of joy. And here it is, you know, January, February, it's dark, it's cold, it's gray, but people have a smile on their face. Strangers are talking to each other. There's Eagles gear everywhere. It's uplifting.
Well, it is that. But then there's also an even more primal dynamic. Like sometimes after a game, I think I've seen this in the news, fans will be so swept into the kettle drum roar that they'll like upturn people's cars.
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
You see these
Especially
images,
here in
you know, of like 40 men flipping a car on its side.
Well,
it's like Titans, you know?
Right. Well, it reminds me of the Maenads. Of Dionysus and the myth. These were women who were followers of the god Dionysus, and they would have these revels in which they really went completely mad. They lost orientation to reality and were in ecstasy, but would sort of rend, possibly people from limb to limb without even realizing what they were doing.
And in a kind of ecstatic trance.
Yes.
Well, there is a Dionysian element to it when the heat is turned up.
Yes.
And there's also research that shows that sports fans, real sports fans, are less depressed, less alienated, and less lonely, and that people feel a sense of real belonging, what you were talking about before, of people high-fiving each other and feeling a sense of brotherhood. Just the other day, I had parked in the car. I saw a car with a man in it, and it had on the front of it an Eagles license plate, not his legal license plate. And, I kind of waved at the guy and gave a thumbs up. And it was a nice moment. And I thought to myself, my goodness, this is a stranger. What's that about? Well, it's about a nice fellow feeling that was easily come by through the commonality of eagle fandom.
But it's an interesting phenomenon, right? The way that we feel this identity with one another in common cause. And it obviously extends out beyond sport.
Yes.
Jung, this was something that Jung talked about and thought about quite a bit. It was sort of he would refer to it as kind of, identification with the collective or sort of mass psychology. And he, understandably, given in the era in which he was writing and living, he was a little mistrustful of this. He said, all human control comes to an end when the individual is caught in a mass movement. Then the archetypes begin to function.
Wow.
So, this thing that you're referring to, Joseph, with people overturning cars or engaging in other,
wild behaviors.
Yeah. It this is, you're caught up in a sort of mass psychological moment.
Right. And another kind of dark example would be this clash that happened in Charlottesville between these two groups, this kind of protesters and these white nationalists. And both are in this swept up field of collective identification, which Jung called participation mystique,
right?
Or the mystical participation in a group.
Why don't you define that for our listeners?
So Jung included this idea in his writings, and he borrowed it from an earlier psychologist, Levi Bruhl. And it talks about a very peculiar kind of psychological connection that people can have sometimes with objects or with teams or with any number of phenomena that is not intrinsically themselves. And they can become so merged with another thing that they can't distinguish themselves from the outer object. This could be something as, innocuous as, being identified with your Boy Scout troop, or something as nefarious as being identified with a dangerous paramilitary group that's, functioning out in the backwoods someplace.
Right. And I mean, I think, that Jung saw participation mystique as an absolutely sort of normal psychological state that we're all subject to at times. And Joseph, as you're pointing out, I mean, this kind of phenomenon happens across many different areas of human endeavor, including certainly politics. And we're sort of looking at it today in relationship to sports and football, but this is what's true for people.
And we're looking at the ambivalence of it, that it can be euphoric. It can actually give people a great experience of excitement, but also it can have a shadow element which we need to soberly appreciate.
Absolutely.
I'm thinking about the developmental origins of participation mystique, of that sense of union and symbiosis. I mean, after all, we all start out in a symbiotic state of being in another's body, another's womb, and then early stages of infancy, where that kind of psychological, psychic union is necessary for the healthy development of a baby. And it's an empathic, archaic, biological, developmental kind of state that can serve as a stepping stone into fellow feeling and empathy of, I just sense without words that you, whoever the you might be, are feeling X or Y or Z. And so I think there is a deeply human element to participation mystique that can serve us. But as you're saying, Joseph, it's, which side of this archetype are we on? There are two sides. There's a plus, and then there is the shadow side.
And one of the things that we would differentiate is this kind of merging experience when it happens in an infant is developmentally essential.
Yes.
For the infant to pattern the way of fitting into the culture, the way of structuring their ground, their fundamental personality. But when we see participation mystique happen in a 40-year-old adult, what is the yearning? What is the reaching for in that way? Like, for instance, are we suggesting that people that are more vulnerable to participation mystique are seeking to correct something in themselves?
I think it's more normal than that. And I think it can happen sort of interpersonally. I mean, I'm sure we all have had the experience of having a really good friend or perhaps a romantic partner with whom at times we just feel so in sync that it's almost like you can participate without speaking. But I also, there's some research done on the fact, one of the things that makes this, and this is from a sort of evolutionary psychology perspective, okay, which I think, Jung would really resonate with this, is one of the things that's unique about humans is our ability to collaborate and work with and sacrifice ourselves for others to whom we are not genetically related.
Yeah.
I thought that there's this study that I read about recently where there was a sort of simple task, simple puzzles that the researchers let toddlers do, and also I think it was chimpanzees. And the chimpanzees and the toddlers could do everything. I think sometimes the chimps figured it out faster than the toddlers.
That's humbling.
Right. But when the task involved collaboration, the toddlers would get it quickly and the chimps never would. For example, if the task involved picking up some sort of log-shaped item that required two people to carry it, the two toddlers would figure out that they could each pick up an end and move it. And the chimps never got there. So this is an interesting thing. It says that somehow one of the fundamental things about being human, and this makes sense if you look at human society, is that we can band together in common purpose. So this idea about being identified with each other, even, like your example of the man in the car, you don't even know him, and you felt this kind of confraternity. And the idea that the fact that we can feel that with each other is pretty important to what makes us who we are as humans. And then there's this idea that the mechanism that creates this ability to feel this is something like a sports team or a political movement or a religion or an ideal.
Or a church.
Teams and brotherhoods. And I'm thinking
universities.
About war too, that your buddies will be there, they will have your back, they will care for you. That aspect of bonding is really very moving. And again, there's a bipolarity, sort of a plus and a darker side. And football players talk about, when they interview them, they say, I couldn't have done it. Maybe I'm the MVP for this game, but it's really the teammates and we're all there for each other. And I think we all do long for this kind of Garden of Eden bonding, safety, belonging.
But isn't it interesting because you raised this idea about war?
And is it not war? Football, to my mind, there is an archetypal warlike construct to it. The two teams face each other and they're going to run right into one another and do battle, as it were. People can get injured in soccer or basketball or rugby, but in football, it is a contact sport as its primary function. And so there really is the battle aspect here, right there on the field with every single play.
And in that way, if we think about it as an archetype of war, that there is something that transcends the human personality, but we are all kind of thrumming with in the background. So there is this pressure to enact these archetypes of war. But what sports allows us to do is to sublimate the impulse to true war and move it into a kind of art form. So football and other sports are kind of an artistic rendering of war, where these aesthetic rules. You're not allowed to do certain things. You really aren't supposed to injure somebody, or if somebody gets injured, they're immediately taken off the field. And that there's this highly limited and dance-like shaping of how the play, almost how the theater of the football is going to unfold on behalf of the spectators, on behalf of the audience. And that the aesthetic of football still carries enough of war that fans will put on war paint. They still feel like they're attending a war.
And they do come in war paint and costume. Absolutely.
But it's the aesthetic of the game that allows it to be safe enough for people to psychologically participate in it and not feel horrified.
So we can discharge some of our emotions vicariously through our team. And it's channeled, contained. There's, as you say, the rules and the aesthetic allow a safe kind of catharsis.
So it's really, we're really talking here about a ritual.
Yeah. A ritual, a drama, a presentation.
A collective ritual of catharsis.
Yes.
Right?
It's a drama.
And catharsis is a wonderful word. It shows up in Aristotle's work, the Poetics. It's the evolution of a Greek word named katharos, which essentially means pure. And as the word is refined, it goes from pure to purifying to cleansing. And then this recognition in the high Greek society of the incredible power of theater, which was considered one of the religious arts. And that when the Greek citizens would participate in theater, the ritual of the theater would rouse and discharge an intensity of emotion, which would free people up and, in a sense, heal them. And we see that with the kind of disinhibition that we note in football games, that people who might be very reserved or quote unquote civilized in their day-to-day life have this permission to howl and shout and pound and cheer in a way that, they're probably not doing in their office. And there is something in the human spirit that needs these releasing and cleansing encounters with emotion, but in a frame that's safe enough, like a theater, like an ancient Greek theater, that no one is going to get hurt by the discharge.
Yes, that's such a good point. There is a safety, and we do need that connection to our instinctual, archaic feelings, a way of remaining in touch and expressing them and experiencing that part of our legitimate humanity.
And it's the art of maintaining the line between the ritual and the aesthetic level of what's happening in the drama of football. And when that collapses, as we see sometimes in soccer games that can happen in South America, where you'll see people will riot, where it's no longer a cathartic art that's happening, but people become possessed by the spirit of war, and they're literally going to battle with each other, and people have been killed.
I was going to say something like, we were sort of talking about participation mystique, and that it has a good side and a bad side, and I was kind of making an argument that it's normal, and maybe we could say something like it becomes potentially dangerous when we don't know that when we don't have a consciousness that that's what's happening to us. So when we're sort of wearing not washing our Eagles jersey for the entire playoff season or something.
Because we think that not washing it is going to help our
the
team win.
Right, which is a great example of participation.
Magical thinking is still alive.
Yes.
Then, there's a way that we kind of know. There's a consciousness to what we're doing.
Yes.
But I think sometimes with political movements or what you're talking about, Joseph, where there really is kind of a possession of the ego by this archetype, this upwelling of this incredible archetypal energy. And it's like we don't even know what's happening to us. That kind of brings me back to the Maenads.
So I'm thinking that what we're saying here is really imaged in football games by the guys on the field and the people up in the skybox who are looking down and saying, do this, stop going left, or don't try that pass play again, or whatever it might be. But that's a wonderful image for what you're saying, Lisa, which is have your feelings and also have an objectivity, retain your thinking function.
Mm-hmm.
You can be
Your
up close and in it, and you can also have that kind of more distanced observation.
Yeah, this is a little bit of an interesting side note, perhaps not directly related to football, but it seems like it fits here. There can be a tendency for those who find Jung's thought interesting and compelling to romanticize the unconscious. But Jung didn't romanticize the unconscious. He knew.
He was cautious about the unconscious.
He was very cautious about it. And he had this, one of his dreams was that he was carrying a little light, a little candle in in the wind. And he was cupping it very preciously. And he said of that dream, that was me protecting my consciousness, that we can, Jung knew that we can all be eclipsed, honestly, by these huge archetypal unconscious forces that well up. So there is, and he certainly saw that, living through 2 world wars in the 20th century. But I think, Deb, you're right. That's a great image, is that we can be witness to what happens and retain a conscious relationship to it.
And we see it in every game with the coaches and their headsets, listening to what the people in the skybox are telling them. And to let both parts have their say equally, equal say from both parts of ourselves, the skybox and the part of us that's on the field and engaged.
Right. So the way the archetype is manifesting in the football field is being highly monitored and very intricately regulated. If 2 opposing members break into a fight on the field, everything mobilizes to stop it immediately, because that breaks the rules, that we've collapsed out of the aesthetic, the art of this being a game of war, and now it's actually concretized into a real war, and that must be stopped. So there's a wonderful, I guess maybe even collective lesson that the Psyche is participating in, which is holding this tension of the sublimatio, of sublimation, that the archetypal energy.
Just talk about sublimatio, Joseph?
Yeah, that's a term that Jung coined from the medieval alchemists, and it was something that the early chemical experimenters observed, that some substances that they would heat up would not go through a liquid stage, but would immediately vaporize. So it would move from solid to vapor. And Jung found these early chemical metaphors incredibly helpful and really informed what he was observing in his clients. So when we think about the concrete horror and maybe sometimes necessity of war and the end of life and the carnage of a true war, and if that is held in an aesthetic container and examined, analyzed for its elements, that it could, in a sense, vaporize into a higher form, which would be the art of the archetype, which could show up as a football game, or it could show up as a theater piece.
The alchemy of football.
The alchemy of football. And if the vaporous, abstracted idea of war in the form of a highly regulated football game collapses back down into the reality of war. Ideally, we're in a place where the game grinds to a halt. Things have to be reset back into their aesthetic frame. And that tension is what's constantly being monitored by the culture itself to make sure that things are ritualized and not concretized.
I'm appreciating you're saying really holding the tension of those two things, the two viewpoints of an objective viewpoint and a subjective participatory viewpoint of not being possessed by the ritual and honoring it, and the concept that Jung had that was so important to his work of holding the tension of the opposites and not falling into either one side or the other, but allowing both to have the full say.
And you'll see this in like the people who coach Little League. So we have these little psyches that are being, really roused up, and the parents want them to win. But the coaches are in there saying, absolutely not, Billy. You shake the hand of the losing team, and here are the rules of good sportsmanship. And hatred and foul play and all of that has no place in the high art of being a good sportsman. So this idea of making sure that it's lifted into this container, and even teaching children to hold the tension
kind of sacralized.
Yes, it's sacralized, but being able to tolerate the tension of wanting to win and being competitive, but that's only okay within the rules of good sportsmanship. And then that turns it into a sport or an art. And that football provides a great example of that the culture derives an awful lot of meaning from.
Speaking of the meaning, I wanted to talk for a minute about the way that some people find transcendent meaning in organized sports.
They do.
I mean, there was a story in a local story in the paper last year about a man who brought his father's ashes to the Eagles parade.
Wow.
And people decorated the graves of their loved ones with Eagles gear. And the way that, if your father was a fan of, the Mets, that becomes part of your fond remembrance of him after he's gone, and maybe what you pass down to your own son, that we and the men in this family are Mets fans or whatever.
It's a place where we can join of a commonality. It's like having a flag or team colors or, the transcendence of here's something that we have in common that has a lot of feeling to it. And, that we can remember, a loved one, to use your example, of remember when we all went to that Eagles game. Remember when, there's a connecting function here. And we are talking about some of the archetypal roots here in something like football. And so I can imagine that it would have that feeling to it.
Well, it connects you with something larger than self, right?
Yes.
It connects you with something larger than ego.
We're really talking about identity formation, that, when the ego is connected only to the very common objects in the environment, that it can have a kind of subdued level of energy, a lower level of energy. But when our egos can be connected with something which is much larger than ourselves and more archetypal, and therefore is kind of a generator of force, the ego feels enlivened and sometimes inflated, but more energy flows into us than would otherwise be there. And that's the seduction and the joy of these archetypal encounters.
I'm thinking that we haven't talked yet about the archetype of the hero. And that is certainly there in football. The MVP for a game, for a season, oftentimes the quarterback. Who's the quarterback? How's the quarterback doing? That the hero archetype is very much there.
Yeah, and it can be projected onto an individual, like you're saying, with the quarterback, or even just the team itself. I mean, I think, the Eagles, we in Philadelphia sort of have an inferiority complex, right? So always starting off, we're always rooting for our team, but, we kind of assume assume they're going to lose, that kind of thing. And to kind of go from that sort of relative underdog status to being the champs, just
it's a hero's journey.
The hero's journey.
And it's a hero's journey every single season of who will get to the Super Bowl and who will win.
Who will fight the dragon and prevail.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So for those who are perhaps unfamiliar with the idea of the hero, Joseph Campbell wrote an extraordinarily comprehensive tome called The Hero with a Thousand Faces, and traced through innumerable ancient cultures this recurring theme of the hero in all kinds of myths, all kinds of fairy tales, and really suggests that the hero archetype is one of the underpinnings of human culture. And in one of the oldest myths that we have, the Epic of Gilgamesh, this ancient Babylonian or Mesopotamian, I can't quite remember which ancient culture it was aligned with at the moment, but it's a hero's myth. I mean, that's what survived. I'm sure now upon reflection that it was Mesopotamian, but what it speaks to us is that, as far back as we can reach archaeologically, the archetype of the hero and the need to retell the story of the hero, and through the retelling to recount it and relive it and be revitalized with some relationship to the hero is just pivotal and core to the human personality. And whether it's guys getting together, at the VA or the American Legion Hall and reliving their war stories, their stories of heroic struggle, and the enlivening dynamism that gives them, or we three sitting there over dinner talking about all the crap we went through in our analytic training, and I've got this scar, somewhere in my emotional body from thus and such happening, and that there's something so powerful about thinking that one is heroic and recounting the proof of that.
Yeah.
And we see it on the football field all the time, of these guys that go out there, they may get injured, and then they're out for the season, they're back the next season. We see the heroism of people that lose the game and come back next week and play again. The individual who really fumbles the ball at a crucial moment and then goes to the bench, gets back up, and does the next play. That you keep going. You keep on trying. There are games where it's a foregone conclusion that the other team is way ahead, let's say, and there are only 2 minutes left. There's no possibility that there could possibly be time for 2 possessions to get 2 touchdowns to even tie the game. But what do? They keep on playing. They give it their all every time. And it's inspiring.
And it's inspiring when it plays out that way. So what you're leaning into is this idea of basking in reflected glory, that as long as an individual can be an adequate screen for the projection of the heroic archetype, people will begin to cheer. But if that person's humanity gets too present, if that person starts playing in a way where they don't win, or they start making mistakes on the field, there's a way in which people will cut and run. And you'll see fans of a particular team get particularly resentful or very, very negative about a team member who's failing to live up to the heroic fantasy and really want them gone. And this idea of cutting off reflected failure, which is this idea that if my team is constantly losing, I will start to get a feeling of disgust for them and not want to be associated with that. And that's also very prevalent in the culture. People don't want to be associated with individuals they think are failing. And that happens very powerfully in the world of football as well.
I don't know. I see the other side of that. I know in Steelers country, where we lived for many years, that it was not a fickle fan base at all. We were, as Pittsburgh citizens, the Steelers were it.
Yes,
win, lose, or draw.
But what you're saying is the Steelers were it. But if individual players started failing the high standard of the Steelers' success, you'll start and you'll hear this at games, somebody, a quarterback throws a pass and it goes wildly away and it causes the loss of the game. People will express hatred. That dumbass, what the hell was he doing?
You hear that if you listen to sports radio.
Yeah.
Which I don't as a general rule, but it is often played in my household. And so, I mean, a lot of times people get angry at the managers, you know what I mean? And oftentimes and I'm thinking more of baseball because that's my household follows baseball more closely. But if a team doesn't do well, you fire the manager, right? So there is this sort of sacrificial act at the end of the season.
Yeah, but there's some kind of a disdain and wanting to separate away from either the part that's failing or the single player that's failing. It is possible that you could still love a team.
That the manager, this is the season we think it's really a problem with the manager or with this particular player. So I think that I see it more in its positive light of what do we need to do to correct course? What do we need to do to win? Do we need to let this player go or not? And that the anger is really a kind of irate, we've got to fix this because of that archetypal battle. And that the battle and the ritual and the seeking the goal is more important than any individual.
Yes, and no, because teams that constantly lose don't have the same level of audience participation that teams that constantly win. That if you have a team that's losing all the time, you don't have the same number of people showing up from that city to cheer you on and watch you lose yet another game. People don't show up. People show up for the teams that are winning all the time. And what I would say archetypally is the loser doesn't constellate the feeling of the hero archetype. The loser doesn't give the audience member, the fan, the feeling of inflation and rising to higher power that the winner does. So something about winning has to be maintained to keep hold of the hero projection and being on the winning side of the war.
I want to just lift this in a slightly different direction for a second. I want to bring up this idea that Jung talked about, the religious function of the psyche.
Okay.
Which, what Jung meant by that term is that we are made to have a need to relate to something larger than ego. And that he said at one point, you can take away a man's gods, but only to give him others in return. So if it's not the God of organized religion, we will project this need elsewhere. And I think for some people, this need to relate to something larger than ego is projected onto sports like football. For example, this is an anecdote that was shared with me by one of my clients who gave me permission to talk about this in the podcast episode. Last year, before the Super Bowl in 2018, a friend of his was driving along a highway and was thinking about the upcoming Super Bowl and, wondering if the Eagles would win. And then he saw an eagle flying close to his car, and he took that as an omen, so that the universe would sort of mobilize in this way to send a sign. I mean, this is really kind of a religious experience, we could say.
I think that's really interesting. I'm just kind of taking that in. The whole idea that, particularly in a secular society, do highly charged sports events fulfill the individual's desire for an exultant religious experience? I think that's very interesting. And I can feel my way into that. I can be very curious about that.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, isn't it, that in today's culture in America, there is a transcendent function. There have been billions of dollars spent on sports arenas. The fans show up. It's this particular sport that is uniquely American. And so, of course, it fulfills a larger need. And we shouldn't trivialize it, but be really curious as to this transcendent function in the archetypes we've talked about of the hero and doing battle. and ritual and so on, that this is a huge element in our culture.
So can you unpack how this is related to the transcendent function as you're imagining it right now?
I'm thinking that it is uplifting, that what we've talked about of cheering and all of the emotions, the identification, the sense of belonging are all very much up beyond ego and lift us into another realm. Being transported. I'm thinking of your example too earlier in our conversation about the maenads. And having a sense of participation mystique and having emotional catharsis and feeling that sense of archaic, primal, and deeply human connection. I'm not thinking of it as anything, sort of fuzzy and cute and warm, like, rainbows and unicorns, but something that is more, that is earthier and filled with energy and that kind of more primal emotion. But it is a transcendence.
Yeah. I mean, I think it is, and it is connection. I mean, we've been kind of dancing back and forth this whole episode, I think, on the sort of positive pole and the negative pole. I mean, the other thing that's coming up for me is that the way that these kind of ecstatic experiences and the archetypal currents of feeling that get provoked can be capitalized on by those wishing to profit from them. And, it is big business. And of course, I'm thinking of the, this tragic thing that's come to light about brain injury among football players, that, the evidence for it was hidden. Why? Because it would cost this huge industry tons of money to admit that the act of playing football puts one in danger of, what is it, encephalopathy?
Yes.
It's kind of post-concussive syndrome. Yeah.
And so I think it's just, again, a kind of wariness about how we relate to this experience of being taken over by archetypal energies, and how it can strengthen us in a way and lift us up, but it also makes us vulnerable to possession.
Yeah, there's a hidden cost, or hidden in people's immediate sense of it. I think of that as well. Before I was working in mental health, I was a movement therapist, an Alexander Technique teacher, and I would see a tremendous number of men in middle age who were having substantial movement problems, and they traced it all back to playing football in high school. And yet many of those same men were determined and incredibly excited to introduce their sons to that exact same world. So that it was very difficult for them to really hold consciously the exultant power and excitement about imagining my son as a hero, and still understand that I am also very likely condemning them to having their knees replaced by the time they're 55 years old. And many of them later in life would confide to me that they really are not sure that it was worth it. And I'm sure these players with post-concussive syndrome, or at least their family members, are asking, was this worth it? Was this sacrifice worth it? But in the archetypal world, the hero's sacrifice is always worth it. The
That's
wounding
true.
of the hero, even the killing of the hero, the whole idea of the honorable death is powerful in this archetype. And when those archetypal lenses get pushed down again out of the aesthetic expression into a concrete form, we also have to find a way to relate to the human horror of that and hold that tension. And the industries that promote this billion and billion dollar machine of football, they don't want to connect people to the human cost of any of this, because it impairs being swept along. It's very tricky.
Yeah, it's really a both and. And perhaps we just leave it at that and before moving to a dream. But before we do, I just want to say one thing. Go Eagles.
Hi, this is Deb from This Jungian Life podcast. Joseph, Lisa, and I have been deeply moved by your response to our work. But producing, editing, and distributing it involves substantial expenses, and now we need your help. Please stop by our website, thisjungianlife.com, and click on the heading, Be Our Patron. You'll be redirected to our Patreon funding page. Patreon helps creators connect with people who believe in projects like ours. There, you can sign up with your credit card to support us for as little as $1 a month. And at higher levels of support, we'll provide special episodes, behind-the-scenes photos and stories, and a chance to join a select pool of listeners for dream interpretations. Once again, please go to thisjungianlife.com and click on Be Our Patron. Thank you.
Okay, today's dream comes to us from a listener, a female listener, age 27, who is a therapist. Here's the dream. For some reason, I brought kitty litter to the bathroom. It was not for a cat, since I don't have one anymore, but had some other purpose. Well, as soon as I put it down, my former cat, Smoky, immediately ran into it. I was surprised to see her since she's been gone, dead, for years, but she was right there and obviously needed to use the litter urgently. I had the impulse to pull her away, but held her back, realizing that she needs to use the bathroom and it's really important not to disturb her in doing that. Then, as I was watching her in the litter box, I saw that she was wrestling with a mouse. As I watched the scene, I saw that both Smoky and the mouse were the same size. It was the size of a large mouse. Smoky seemed to be winning, but it was definitely a wrestle. They were raising up dust and moving very quickly, so it was hard to see what was happening, but I saw Smoky making cuts on the mouse's back and body, and even saw some blood. I had the sense of cheering her on.
Yes. It's like a gladiatorial event happening in the litter box.
Exactly.
Okay, and here's the context the dreamer gives. I'm in a huge life transition, having found the love of my life and living together, as well as talking about getting married, as well as talking about moving to a different city. I've been making enormous strides in separating from my mother, who has been struggling with the fact that we are not as close as we used to be now that I'm so close with my partner. I'm also in the process of shifting my analytic awareness toward Jungian psychology and terminating an 8-year-long therapeutic relationship in order to work with a new therapist. Main feelings in the dream, she says, first surprised at seeing my deceased cat, then a bit of a shock at seeing her start to wrestle with a mouse, then excitement at seeing her winning the fight against the mouse. Mm-hmm. I have asked, are there any important elements that require a bit more explanation? And she tells us more about her cat. She says, I had to give Smoky away when she was 10 years old because I developed asthma. At the time when I had her, I was early in my analysis and working on my anger, which would often be turned inward. And she said that was all some time ago, some number of years ago. So
the first thing that just strikes me is, we're in the bathroom. Those of us that do clinical dream analysis, we often hear people having bathroom dreams and all the stuff that goes on in bathrooms. That, it's this very specific place where all the civilized part of our personality falls away, and we're dealing with washing ourselves as we're naked. We're dealing with defecation and urination and brushing our teeth, and all of these intimate kind of primal events happen in bathrooms that wouldn't happen somewhere else. So it gives us the sense that, we're dropping deeper than the kind of social personality, and what's observed in the bathroom is really at the core.
Mm-hmm. And the ritualized, I'm relating this to what we were just talking about of football, of how all these rules keep things confined and well contained. And that's why we have bathrooms. That's why we, do ritualize these behaviors. Privacy, closed doors, something you do alone, a safe way to have contact with our primal bodily functions.
Yeah, so there are things that happen in the bathroom that don't happen in the living room.
Exactly.
Or don't happen out at the restaurant or in the middle of the restaurant. And that we have this agreement that we have a set-aside place, a stage, a litter box, where certain things will happen.
I'm sort of just looking at the exposition of this dream, okay? It's for some reason, the ego doesn't know why she's doing it. I brought kitty litter to the bathroom. And so somehow this act of bringing kitty litter to the bathroom sets the stage and kind of potentiates this whole drama.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I think that's interesting.
It is, in that she's giving us a sense that she does have a highly developed intuitive side to her personality that she's able to listen to. Something inside of her said, bring the kitty litter to the bathroom, and the dream ego is able to kind of roll with it.
Right.
And see where we're going to go.
That feels like there's some kind of linking up between the deep unconscious and the conscious personality.
And a willingness.
Yeah. An openness to that.
And of course, kitty litter being in the bathroom, it's just it's another version of what a bathroom is.
Exactly.
But it's a particular invitation to the instinct, because cats gravitate to kitty litter. Like, you don't actually have to teach a cat. All you have to do is show it to them. And then the cat knows this is a place where bathrooming is going to occur.
I like that. An invitation to the instinct. I really like that.
It draws the cat to you to have kitty litter there, which of course it does.
This is, I have readied the space for you to have this release, which feels urgent.
Well, she says that. The cat then does, in fact, or dead cat, the spirit of her cat, is invoked.
Exactly.
By the kitty litter.
She's welcoming. I mean, she brings the kitty litter to the bathroom for some reason, but she's willing to go with that unconscious even to the dream ego, sort of directive, as it were, of thou shalt bring kitty litter to the bathroom. And then she is also very willing to have the cat use the kitty litter, and she says she needs to use the bathroom. It's really important not to disturb her. So again, this willingness to serve the instinctive function represented by Smoky, and then appears the mouse.
Well, I want to just pick up a wonderful little moment there, which speaks well to the therapy that she's been in, is that she notices that the cat has an urgency. The ego has an impulse to want to pull her away, but she's able to contain that and then to let something occur. And that's a wonderful quality that all of us, on the path to greater consciousness can really learn from that moment, that the unconscious will try to bring a revelation. The ego will often have an impulse to want to shut it down because it might make us aware of something that we're uncomfortable with. And very wonderfully, she is able to hold back that impulse to shut it down, which then allows another revelation to kind of happen in the dream. What a great object lesson to all of us in that moment.
Yeah. That is nice. And so it's so curious that it's Smoky, right? This dead cat. It's a particular cat. And so I think that her further information, her association to Smoky really matters, that she had to give Smoky away, which, if you have a pet, that's hard.
That's a big deal.
Yeah. And
it's a real sacrifice.
Poor Smoky was older because the dreamer had developed asthma at a time when she was working on anger. So we might wonder whether Smoky re-entering the scene here in this dream has something to do with this dreamer's ability to be in contact with her anger and her aggression.
Yes.
And Joseph, I think it fits with what you were pointing out, because now perhaps we might understand that she has a sort of a right relationship with anger and instinctual aggression, because she doesn't need to pull it back, but can let it have its way. And then that results in this tussle with the mouse. And what could be sort of more archetypally natural than a gladiatorial conflict between a mouse and a cat.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that is this kind of primordial opposition.
And they're the same size.
Yes.
So it's sort of a fair fight. It's a real contest.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I can't help but think about the parallels to football.
Yeah.
It's a fair fight, 2 teams, same number of people, and that the mouse and the cat can have it out with one another. And the aggression, I'm thinking about the link between aggression and anger. And they're very closely tied together.
Yes, they
they
sure
kind
are.
of live next door to one another in maybe a duplex house of some kind, psychologically speaking.
Because sometimes when we're angry, that tells us that we need to access our aggression.
Yes. And sometimes the ritual of football is interrupted by a fight between 2 players, and the teams gather around, and the coaches and the referees separate them. So they're very closely tied, and that something does need to be mobilized, something needs to be enacted. And she says, "I have the sense of cheering Smoky on, rooting for Team Smoky."
Right.
Now that's the part I feel suspicious about.
Okay.
And the reason is that, first of all, it's very odd for a mouse to be the size of a cat. So we know that there's something going on in the psyche that's a little mythologic. And most mice are spending a lot of time trying to flee from the attacking cat. They don't wrestle back. So now you've got, I mean, I probably wouldn't call it a mouse. I'd probably call it a rat.
Well, right. She says they're both the size of a large mouse. So the cat has gotten smaller too.
So the cat is teeny.
That's what I think.
And the mouse is teeny.
Right.
Which in and of itself is strange. But the fact that the mouse is wrestling back is putting this in a very different, now we're in like Aesop's fables, like we're in an archetypal world. So the litter box appears, the cat appears, the mouse appears, and we're looking at this movement of the power of urgency from object to object to object. Urgency and aggression. So one of the things I'd like to suggest is that the cat gets filled with the power to fight, and then the mouse gets filled with the power to fight, which is the really unusual moment in the dream.
Yes.
Most mice don't have the power to wrestle, but this mouse has the power to wrestle. The ego thinks she's cheering on the cat because the cat has a nostalgic value to her. But the real little miracle in the dream is that you have a gladiator mouse who's fighting back. And it's this tension between the cat and the mouse and what could be an equal balance. So stepping way back, I'm curious about whether the cat should win or what the kind of cheering on energy with the cat is about. And I'm curious about the mouse part of her, which is gaining the ability to fight back. And wondering, why does the psyche think she needs a more muscular mouse in her? And maybe the cat needs to be contained by mouse energy. Because having mouse energy in the psyche is very different from having cat energy. Mice are not predators. Mice take care of their children. Mice are highly sensitive. Mouse energy is really different from cat energy. And I'm wondering if the psyche is saying, maybe you need a big muscular mouse energy in your psyche to introduce you to something that can stand up to the catness inside of you. I think that's very possible. I'm really enjoying imagining like how this mouse got into the fight. And all of a sudden, I'm thinking of the litter box as almost like a World Federation wrestling ring, and in this corner is the cat. And then this mouse shows up in a mask and a cape. And in this corner is the mouse, and they're equally matched. Because in the dream, the cat, which would normally happen in the natural life, a cat would hunt for a mouse and then drag it forward and, fight it and torture it and stuff like that. But here, it feels like the mouse has shown up in his corner or her corner of the ring, and the fight is on.
I'm thinking about how one of our Jungian analysts who's well known, named Pat Berry, talks about the dream ego's representation in a dream as being wrong, that we want to flip it on its head, so to speak, and go the other direction. So I'm imagining in this context, I hope I'm doing a reasonable justice here, of the cat as being very closely aligned with the dream ego. It was her cat, her pet. There was an attachment there. And now the cat is in the dominant position in this very literal game of cat and mouse.
Mm-hmm.
But what about the mouse? What if the mouse has a legitimacy? What if the mouse, as the less familiar and perhaps disliked part of the psyche, as a symbol of something in the dreamer, what if we went to the mouse and said, who are you? And what do you want? And how did this get constellated as a battle?
Yeah, and the mouse is the thing that brings the new value, isn't it?
I think so.
So what are mice? What might we imagine as, animals often carry a lot of symbolism in stories and in myths, and we have associations.
And James Hillman wrote a wonderful book called Dream Animals. He really encouraged people to go into the naturalistic information, like literally learn about what mice are in the real world, because our unconscious minds do know about them at that realm, and make sure we're translating actual facts into psychological correlates. So, the fact that mice are incredibly sensitive, they have incredibly attuned senses. Their ears are really big. They're able to pick in all kinds of information.
They often kind of move around a lot at night.
They're silent.
Yeah.
And they have families.
They definitely have families.
They have families that are caring. And there are a lot of little stories about mice. When I was a child, my grandmother made up stories for my sister and me. We loved them. And the hero of the story world was Teensy Mouse. And Teensy Mouse lived with his family, and they lived in, behind the wall somewhere. And Teensy Mouse had all these little adventures. And there are other fables about mice and the mouse that pulls the thorn out of the lion's paw. There's a warmth and a tenderness often for mice. Living their familial.
Yeah, they're timid, aren't they? They're not bold and predatory like a cat.
They're timid, but they scurry around behind walls. In other words, there's a kind of freedom and safety that they find by not being out there and being warlike.
They're not. I think that the traditional association of mice being timid is tricky, because if we think about them in a purely naturalistic sense, they're highly adventurous. That mice are constantly probing around, looking for the opening, and they're able to get into these tiny spots, spaces. In fact,
like my
other than the
drawers.
skull, the body of a mouse can flatten down, to this very, very broad, flat way, and they kind of creep forward on their toes. So mouse energy gets you into every little crack and crevice in the psychic life, and without harm, to be able to silently come in along the baseboards of areas where a larger part of the psyche might be injured. But,
this
scared.
Mouse in the dream is a fighter.
Yes.
So it's kind of anti-naturalistic, as you have pointed out.
That's true. This is definitely a fairy tale mouse.
Yeah.
This is a mighty mouse.
But even Mighty Mouse had a sweetness to him, with his little uniform and his little song of "Here I am to save the day."
Yes, and fighting for truth and justice.
But there was a sweetness to him. He wasn't really, warrior aggressive.
Wasn't despotic.
So this would be a place where, again, I'd really be interested in hearing from the dreamer about. I'm curious, what would happen if the mouse won this fight?
Yeah. And you had more mouse energy.
Just even kind of in imagination. I mean, is the mouse going to kill the cat? Is that what's being imagined? Or
was the mouse on board here to be, in a way, a victim, as if it's a fair fight? because there's some aggression that needs to be unleashed and expressed.
Yeah, somehow I think this dream is about aggression and its place in the psyche, and she says, that she's trying to separate from her mother, which of course that is a life task that requires some aggression.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So it would be interesting to explore with the client, what are the various manifestations of cat energy in her psyche, one of which could be the relationship with the mother, the various parts of her that are mouse energy, and her ambivalence about identifying with the mouse. I mean, cats seem more powerful in our minds, so it can often be very hard for us to want to identify with a part of us that's small and delicate and stealthy and fragile by comparison. It's not as exciting. And talking about that whole idea of the fandom, so at a football game, do you want to identify with the Tigers? Or do you want to identify with the mice? Which would you gravitate towards in terms of giving you a sense of power and attunement to heroic majesty?
Yeah.
The tigers, the felines are more seductive in terms of what it's going to make us feel about
There are
ourselves.
no football teams named the mice.
There are the Mighty Ducks.
There are. I think there might be some little league teams that are named the mice, but the parents just thought that was cute. so the power of cuteness, can perhaps go some distance.
Right.
So maybe we can imagine a dialogue for this dreamer.
Yeah.
Between her inner cat and her inner mouse, and how each of those lives in her psyche as symbols of certain kind of energy, and encourage the two of them to keep speaking and keep manifesting, so that there can be a real conversation between her and some other parts of herself.
And in order for her to do that, I would fantasize she would need to stop cheering the cat on, and she'd have to break up the fight. Because the tension between cat and mouse, that they're opposites in a certain way.
Yeah, I was going to say the opposites have been constellated here.
So she needs to come in and, pick up the cat by the scruff of the neck.
Or maybe.
I think so. Because the natural tension in the dream is that the cat and the mouse are going after each other. And if she wanted to have a dialogue between the two of them, she'd have to contain the tension between the two, rather than just looking for one to kill the other, which would be a form of splitting, that only one thing gets to survive in the psyche, at least at that juncture. So what would it be like? Bandage up the mouse, separate them, and learn about them.
I'm thinking about what you said, Lisa, about how the opposites have been constellated, and how do we manage the opposites of holding the tension between the two so each can have its say, and that this has gone from wrestling. She says that that's what they're doing. It was a wrestle. Then it goes into a more bloody battle and a one-sidedness of cheering Smoky on. And that constellates, somebody has to win versus what's going on here and how to hold the tension of cat energy and mouse energy.
And the wrestling is a much more useful metaphor of holding tension between dynamics in the psyche.
And no one's going to die. It's like a football game. There are rules, conventions. It's a ritualized kind of battle. Whereas at the end of this dream, the cat is winning and there's blood.
Yeah.
Right. In the wrestling, there's a possibility to invoke Jung's idea of the transcendent function, which is if the mouse part of her and the cat part of her wrestle long enough, a whole new image, a whole new creature, a mouse cat creature of some kind is going to emerge, which holds the qualities of both energies without diminishing either of them. And that's a great mystery what that would look like, but it's possible.
So cheering cheering Smoky on is potentially an image of the collapse of the tension of opposites.
Yes, and a retreat back into this old part of the psyche, which the dreamer knew well.
Mm-hmm. Perhaps.
It's interesting. It's a very interesting dream.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.